Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's session of Turn on Federalism. We will start in a few minutes' time. Thank you.
Welcome to today's session of Turn on Federalism. My name is Claudia Fackler and I work at the Untitled Foundation in Munich as project coordinator at the Institute for International Cooperation. We are co-organizing this event together with 50 Shades of Federalism. Please allow me to say a few words about Turn on Federalism, our partners, and about today's session before I hand over to our speakers. Our Turn on Federalism seminar is a cooperation between Untitled Foundation and 50 Shades of Federalism. The Untitled Foundation is a German political foundation with a mandate of the German Federal Parliament. Our core task is to promote and support democracy and the rule of law within Germany, especially through civic education in Bavaria, but also through worldwide activities in more than 60 partner countries. The second partner is 50 Shades of Federalism, which is a website project established in 2017 by Søren Keil and Paul Anderson. 50 Shades of Federalism publishes short papers on different discussions on federalism. Our online series, Turn on Federalism, aims to discuss the 50 Shades of Federalism papers, to engage with experts, politicians, and civil society actors around the world in order to look at the possibilities of federalism, its different shades, and also its country-based evolutions. The idea is to create a network of cooperation and exchange. For further information, you can also visit our website or follow us on Twitter. Our session today considers and compares the discussions on federalism, power sharing, and others in divided societies. We will look at the question, how can federal designs move beyond the focus on ethnic group accommodation and ensure the rights of others as well? And how can non-dominant groups affect federal institution building and discussions in post-conflict societies? Of course, we will also discuss what best practices exist for inclusion of others in federal and power sharing arrangements. Please allow me to introduce our today's speakers. Our speaker is Alison McCulloch. She is an associate professor of political science in Brandon University, Canada. And the event will be moderated by Thea Bechler. She's a scientific researcher at the Institute of Federalism at the University of Fribourg. If you have any questions or comments, please use the Q&A box. We will collect your questions and pass them on to our speakers. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope you will enjoy today's session, and without any further delay, please allow me to hand over to Alison McCulloch. Alison, you have the word.
Hi, thanks. Let me just share my screen here. Great, thank you. I'm delighted to be here and very much looking forward to the conversation that will follow today. So I was asked to structure my talk around a short piece I wrote for the 50 Shades of Federalism project, which would have been back in 2017, 2018. So feeling like a bit of an eternity ago now. It's been a great opportunity to revisit and perhaps refine my thinking on the topic and to consider what, if anything, has changed in the intervening period. So my focus for today will be on the role of what we might call others, by which I mean those who do not fit easily into ethnic categories in federal and other power sharing arrangements. So I'll aim to answer or address three questions. Who is another? How might they be impacted by federalism and power sharing? And how might we think about designing institutions for greater inclusion of others? First, however, let me orient my remarks in relation to existing debates on federalism and power sharing. So as this speaker series and the 50 Shades of Federalism project make clear, debates on federalism are far from settled. There are indeed a variety of ways in which to think about the design of federations, from the size of units to the number of units, to the degree of centralization or as well as to notions of symmetry and asymmetry in the distribution of powers. By and large, however, there are sort of two countervailing perspectives on conflict management and constitutional design for divided societies: integration and accommodation. Accommodation consists of dual or multiple public identities, and that those identities need to be recognized within formal political structures. Of equality with the institutional respect for difference. A federation inspired by accommodation would design such a way as to while maintaining shared rule arrangements between groups at the center, right? We can think of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Belgium, Ethiopia, Canada as this kind of arrangement. Likewise, consociational arrangements would follow this kind of accommodative logic. Integration, on the other hand, seeks a single public identity coterminous with the state's territory. This can be supported through the design of heterogeneous units that cut across group lines rather than around them. Federalism has often been advocated because it disperses power and thus conflict away from the ethnic divide, and is inspired by federal practices in places like the United States and Nigeria. So scholars continue to actively debate the ability of either form of federalism to manage diversity, to build trust between contending groups, and to create the conditions for stability and democracy in divided societies. So I don't intend to settle that debate here today. But what I do want to highlight is that both accommodation and integration share what we might call a selection bias, in that they start with the same reference point of ethnic divisions in thinking about how to construct federal or power sharing arrangements. But a lot gets lost along the way when we only focus on ethnicity. Ethnicity may even be the primary cleavage in a divided society, but it is never the only way in which citizens organize and make meaning in their lives. As Donald Horowitz has argued, nowhere is politics reducible to the common denominator of ethnic ties. Even in the most severely divided society, there are always other issues. And this is, I think, part of the issue with accommodation and integration. There's an overemphasis on an overdetermination of ethnicity in federal design. It's to design through it or around it. Likewise, or sort of accordingly, there's an underappreciation of the impact of those institutional choices for those whose political identity does not align with the ethnic divide, that group that is often referred to as others. So who are the others and why do they matter? So if both forms of federalism pay little attention to others, it may be because others as a category is not a single monolithic group. The term is actually quite amorphous, serving as a catch-all or residual category for anyone who doesn't identify in ethnopolitical terms, right? Or who chooses not to align with the dominant ethnic cleavage. And I'll say that the term other is probably less than ideal, in part because, again, it includes different kinds of groups with different experiences of exclusion, different political objectives. This can make it difficult to assess how those different groups experience exclusion and how we might resolve it. So I'm not necessarily particularly sold on the term other. We might use non-dominant or non-aligned minorities here. Others use the term minorities within minorities to mean approximately the same thing. At the same time, the term is used both in academic literature and indeed in some peace agreements and constitutions, which is why I use the term here. So we can think of three broad groupings that might fall in under this broad or residual sort of category. First is what we might call ethnic others. This includes those whose primary political identity might be ethnic, but which is not recognized or accommodated in the government structure, or who do not have a constituent unit to call their own. This might be because the group is either a very small share of the population, they might be territorially dispersed across the country rather than concentrated. We might think of sort of multi or mixed ethnic family backgrounds, or newly arrived or migrant populations here as well. So we can think of indigenous peoples in settler societies, the Roma across many Eastern European countries, very small groups like the Fur, the Masali in Sudan, the Twa in Burundi and Rwanda, and so on. The second category would include those who seek political participation and representation on a socially relevant identity other than ethnicity, right? And for whom it's that identity that has been the basis for their exclusion and marginalization from political life. This is very often centered on gender, on sexuality, increasingly perhaps also on disability, but could really include any core identity features not accounted for in the federal or power sharing structure. Indeed, there's a rich literature, for example, on how women's rights are affected by federal designs, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Finally, the term other is also used to refer to those who reject all identity-based labels, who instead would prefer to pursue perhaps ideological political participation. We can think of traditional left-right politics here, environmental activism, so green parties, that kind of thing. And again, here, there's a conscious choice to disconnect social and ethnic identities from political identities and representation. So some might give this group a little bit more latitude, but they might find in particular consociational arrangements and other forms of power sharing more difficult. It might be tempting to dismiss the role of others, arguing that such groups are unlikely to destabilize state functions, right? That they're unlikely to make or break a peace deal. in part because their disruptive potential is often quite small. As a result, their exclusion is commonly perceived to be part of some kind of necessary trade-off in getting warring parties to agree to peace and to cooperate. So for example, nor the seek territorial solutions to the problems of exclusion. Likewise, very small groups or territorially dispersed groups cannot easily mount secessionist campaigns. Consequently, such groups find it difficult to get a seat at the table, to have their specific issues make it to the top of the political agenda, particularly when we think of federalism as a conflict resolution device. Right? Indeed, parties that come to power through peace negotiations and federal and power sharing arrangements after war are often reluctant to accommodate these others, in part because they are cross-cutting, right? The conflict may not be based on these identities, yet part of the issue here is that this misses the point that federalism and power sharing are never only just devices for conflict resolution. They are also whole of society approaches to democratic governance. So there's sort of an important impetus here for thinking about how to make sure that both federalism and power sharing are meeting that democratic criteria. So how might we then begin to enhance the potential for the democratic inclusion of others? Here, let me suggest that three broad questions should probably guide our thinking on institutional design choices. First, we want to think about whether or not federalism would produce differential policy impacts for others. Here, we might consider which issues get allocated to which level of government. So it's common practice, for example, to allocate healthcare to subunits in a federation. As part of this, however, women's access to reproductive rights and to maternal health provisions or to members of the trans community and gender affirming health provisions might look very different in different units, creating uneven healthcare delivery. Likewise, so personal status laws on things like marriage, divorce, and custody may look very different, again, in different parts of the country. And when these issues are devolved to religious authorities, as they are, for example, in Lebanon, they may end up restricting the rights of gender and sexual minorities, as well as rights of multi-faith couples. So we want to be thinking about what impact that the sort of distribution of powers might have on others. A second question would consider whether or not the design of federalism constrains or enhances the mobilizing potential of others. The academic literature here is mixed. Some scholars point to what they call a federalism advantage, claiming that federalism enhances the mobilization potential for others through things like venue shopping, right? The ability to lobby more than one level of government to have your voices heard. Groups that live across the whole territory of the state may find the boundaries between units constrain their ability to work together. And thirdly, does federalism promote or limit the legislative representation of others? So again, another important line of inquiry considers the sort of descriptive representation of groups. Here, federalism multiple access points might serve them well. It creates a greater number of elected positions to fill, again, more opportunities to lobby. And at least one study has found that federalism has a moderate effect on representation, at least for women, returning 3 to 4% more female representatives than unitary states. So again, worth noting that not all institutional design choices will negatively impact others, right? We've got a bit of a mixed record. And part of the issue is, again, to begin to think about how these might affect others, either positively or negatively. So In turning to the question of institutional design choices, we want to think about whether there's a way to design federal and power sharing arrangements that do not produce differential impacts, that do not constrain mobilization, and which do enhance representation. So which institutional options are available, especially for those groups for whom the creation of their own federal unit is not a viable option? Here, it might be useful to think in terms of institutional innovations at the center, as well as day-to-day decision-making procedures. And I'll note that of these options that I'll talk about, they don't fit all others, nor do they individually on their own fix all problems of exclusion. But it's sort of to start to think about what are some of the available institutional options. Perhaps the most common response has been some kind of reserved seat or quota, either for small ethnic groups or based on gender as well. Again, both reserved seats and electoral quotas stipulate a minimum number of candidates or seats for representatives from designated groups, and they could be applied in the legislature, the executive, or both. And again, can look very, very different. So quotas or seats for reserved others, again, might include threshold exemptions for ethnic parties, particularly in proportional representation systems. So where ethnic communities are intermixed or where heterogeneous, you can remove the national threshold for parties representing small communities, as in many Central and East European countries. You can districts where groups are relatively concentrated. We see this in India and New Zealand and Bolivia, Taiwan, previously. Or you can have pan-ethnic party quotas, right? Where as parties develop their party lists of slates of candidates, you make sure that from other groups within that. Burundi, Singapore, Pakistan might be some examples there. Quotas for ethnic tip, so making sure that that both women and men have access to representation, again, can be done through party lists, so every second or third name on the list from the less represented gender, or again, setting aside a number of seats for women with co-optation if the election doesn't turn out enough to meet the threshold. Certainly one thing to watch out for here is, as Karen Bird has argued, that the objectives of ethnic and gender quotas can sometimes conflict. Because reserved ethnic seats often only give 1 or 2 seats to small minorities, they often produce an overrepresentation of men. Gender quotas, on the other hand, tend to enhance the representation of women from the majority community. So when you combine them, there's a risk that minority women will face or bear the brunt of exclusion. So again, thinking about how they might work together would be important. Another strategy, which is more common in consociations perhaps than in federations, is to give some institutional meaning to the word other. So in South Tyrol, the term applies to anyone who does not want to declare membership in one of the region's 3 official languages. It's typically thought to refer to those who have mixed language backgrounds, like bilingual families, or to migrant populations. The term is also used in Singapore. The general voters in Fiji before 2013 might be another example here. The term, however, is probably most closely associated with the Northern Ireland Assembly, where parties must declare or designate as unionist, nationalist, or other once they're elected to the Assembly. So there's no formal definition of who counts as other, but a wide range of parties have adopted the label for reasons ranging from binationalism, gender equality, environmentalism, and socialism. So what this kind of community designation might be able to do is ensure some representation in others, not just in the legislature, but also perhaps in the executive. So it can serve as the basis for portfolio allocation and entry into cabinet. It might work for the assignment of parliamentary committee responsibilities or for resource allocation and other budgetary considerations. At the same time, we want to be cautious of the reverse as well. So in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Constitution creates the category of other, leaving it undefined, assuming to cover both national minorities and the nationally undeclared. So happy to talk more about that in the Q&A, but it's been particularly contentious in that it's been used rather than to serve as the basis for inclusion. Let me just go back here for a second. It marks out others for exclusion rather than for inclusion, right? So difficulty running for the presidency or serving in the upper house. Third, for very small groups, again, for micro minorities who are unlikely to be able to mount a case for a parliaments for the Sami in a number of Scandinavian countries might be another option there. Finally, day-to-day parliamentary procedures might also make the difference because they can help to create a welcoming environment or not. For women, this might include the establishment of women's caucuses, childcare and parental leave arrangements, family-friendly sitting hours, and so on. For small minorities, the ability to communicate in minority languages with simultaneous translation in parliamentary debates, the observance of minority religious holidays, both might send a message that their experiences and priorities are valued. And in both cases, the creation of support mechanisms like training and mentoring for new candidates might help to turn descriptive representation into substantive outcomes. So others face an uphill battle for inclusion in divided societies, in part because they often cut across the dominant line of division, because their capacity for disruption is often minimal, and because they may continue to face everyday forms of discrimination embedded in societal norms, right? So sexism, homophobia, racism. In light of those constraints, it becomes all the more important to see federalism and power sharing not just as forms of conflict resolution between majorities and minorities, but those whole of society responses, right? And important to no longer see others as an afterthought, right? Whose exclusion is understood as some kind of necessary byproduct of peacemaking. Because ultimately, even if a federation's origins are ethnic specific, this should not preclude bringing gender, sexuality, disability, ideology, and class into the design process. Doing so acknowledges that citizens' identities are complex and multi-layered, right? And reflecting these varied ways in which citizens' lives in governing institutions is likely to enhance institutional legitimacy and stability, qualities that are often in short supply societies. So maybe I will end things there. Again, thank you very much. And I'm very much looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison, for this interesting presentation. It is now my honor to moderate this Q&A. Are now, of course, very welcome to put your questions into the Q&A box, and please be short and succinct so that we can answer as many questions as possible. Maybe while you're thinking about how to formulate your questions, I will take the liberty to kick off with one or two questions to Alison. And I would like to quickly pick up the last point that you mentioned in your conclusion of your presentation, when you brought up the post-conflict context. For the accommodation, the inclusion, or for the accommodation of others, inclusion is key. And at the same time, in post-conflict power sharing systems, or in post-conflict federal systems, we're often confronted with the fact that they are designed to accommodate specific groups, oftentimes specific ethnic groups, and in doing so exclude others. Especially when conflict parties have to be brought to the table, which is something that you mentioned in the beginning of your presentation. What would you suggest? Like, how can this dilemma be addressed? How can the accommodation of others still play a role in such contexts?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think really sort of gets at the crux of the issue. So I think the first thing I would say is that the inclusion of others does not necessarily, or doesn't, undermine the accommodation of sort of those traditional groups of ethnic majorities and minorities. Indeed, in many cases, we're talking about groups that are small enough not to tip the balance, so you can still work these inclusive mechanisms in alongside those other kinds. For women, well, I mean, they're 50% of the population, and it's sort of just a democratic prerequisite to include them, right? So thinking about different mechanisms for doing so. Part of the issue, again, as we start to think of, if we only think of it as a conflict regulation device, then we're only going to look at those parties that have that disruptive potential. But that's not everyone in society, and that there are ways to do that, I think, and to do so certainly at 3 different levels, right? So the first is to think about, in those negotiations, so in peace agreements and that kind of thing, who is invited to the table by what mechanism, right? And it has to be more than just a capacity for violence to warrant that ability to be included, right? And there are different ways to ensure that in negotiations you're including those different voices, whether it's through electoral processes, through advisory boards, through the selection by chief mediators and civil society mobilization, that kind of thing. The second is then to think about what are the consequences of these institutional choices for others. So it's not to say that they should be accommodated at the expense of majorities and minorities, but how to do it alongside. And then again, at the level of policy making, right? We're using a sort of intersectional lens to think about how proposed policies will affect different constituencies. And it's just widening our scope of thinking about who's being affected by these choices.
Can I maybe cut back to the beginning of your presentation, where you were talking about the two perspectives of identity in the context of federalism, integration and accommodation. And maybe it is a bit of a stupid question, but it almost sounded like integration, like designed away from ethnic divide, may actually be more in favor of the accommodation of others than the perspective of accommodation would be. Is this conclusion way too easy, or what is?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a good question. I think part of the issue is that when we only use integration, we often end up privileging majorities, right? And so it may not, it might have a little bit more room for others, but also may not, right? So again, particularly when we're thinking of small groups, those kinds of choices on descriptive representation that are more aligned with accommodation might actually serve them better in making sure that their voices aren't drowned out in an integrationist arrangement. So I think it's, again, much of this is context driven. So thinking about particular cases, thinking about different communities and what it is that they want in terms of their relationship with the state. So I think there's something to be said for accommodation, but you're right that it then, we end up making choices about who then has to be included. And that's often then leaves certain groups out. In integration, again, if you're cutting across that, the hope is that it starts to mediate and create different kinds of ways of organizing, but that doesn't always happen in practice either. So it's a good question, but I think there's a lot of contingency here on how that would work in practice.
Mm-hmm. I do have a question from the audience. And for everyone else who I'd like to invite you to write it into the Q&A box. The question is, I think the guiding questions may have different answers depending they are applying. For example, ethnic federalism affect mobilizing potential of others. How could we say that these are a look again at your slide where you mentioned the guiding questions and
pull that back up again? Yeah, so again, great question, thank you. So when I say guiding questions, I mean that when we start to think of impact and again, creating differences for members of the same community who live in different parts of the state. We also, again, want to think about what do those choices mean for the ability of others to participate in the system, right? So when I say mobilizing potential, it means, are they able to organize across the whole state? What are some of the barriers to that? So are sort of divisions being replicated in sort of those cross-cutting groups, for example? So do women's groups across the country able to organize together? Or is there a way in which it can enhance that mobilization, again, using some of in an accommodationist arrangement, some of that logic that's already there on descriptive representation to move forward? And then again, what are the impacts on formal sort of political representation, descriptive representation? So these are guiding questions in the sense of when we start to think about what the different kinds of choices available in federal and power sharing designs, these are some of the things we should keep in mind. And as the question notes, the answers will be very different based on the different kinds of logics that inform those design questions. But they're broad questions to keep in mind as we start to think about those choices.
Thank you very much. There is another question regarding the category of others. I'm sorry, I have to read the question first.
Yeah, that's okay.
I can translate it to you. The use of the category of others risks categorizing them in the same way that we categorize ethnic groups. So we're precisely undermining what makes them different, as we have seen in Bosnia, for example. This is a quote that I'm quoting from a question. What is your thought on this dilemma again, where you're constantly confronted with the need to categorize groups again, even though you somehow at the same time want to overcome these differences?
Right. Again, excellent point. And it is one of the challenges, right? So again, the term other is less than ideal because, there's an othering sort of component to it. Again, it sort of serves as that catch-all for everyone who doesn't sort of align with that ethnic divide, either in a majority or a minority sense. And so there's a lot of diversity within the group, which makes it difficult to have a single category. Likewise, again, thinking of that last category, that for a lot of people, it's, in that sort of integrationist logic of taking those descriptive identities out of politics and thinking about other ways of organizing political life. I think what it comes down to is to thinking about who is seeking inclusion on what terms, and to think about if there are groups that are seeking to contest presidential elections in Bosnia but are excluded from doing so, how might we open up those arrangements in it? I see there's a follow-up question.
Yes, there is a follow-up question. And the question is whether or not there is a danger to categorize women, LGBTQI groups, and those refusing ethnic identification, as you mentioned in your presentation as well, in the same group. Does it not result in them losing their individual markers that actually makes them different, or that is part of their identification?
Yeah, and that's precisely why in the research project on which this is based, the exclusion and mid-inclusion dilemma, we identified different kinds of groups, right? That so you've got the catch-all category, and then you've got sort of recognition of different kinds of mobilizations or different kinds of identities being expressed within that. I think that, yeah, having one single category to include everyone is pretty, again, sort of obscure some of those things that make those groups distinct. And so I do think that more work needs to be done on thinking about some of the terminology, thinking about how we go about recognizing that difference without, again, putting people into narrow boxes.
And in your when you were looking at the institutional design that could accommodate the others, is there actually particularities that you think have to be taken into consideration depending on which group that we're talking about? You mentioned the ethnic others, ethnic rejecting others, and issue-oriented others, which of course, again, are very broad categories, but can you maybe elaborate whether or not also the institutional design measures or the provisions that you mentioned in your presentations, whether they have to be taken into, they have to consider the different categories that you have defined?
Those places that use the term other, right, like in Northern Ireland or South Tyrol or Bosnia, it often is trying to and so I do think that and on one hand that gives groups flexibility to think about articulate their interests and to think about what it is, what kinds of inclusion they may want, or how to resist and push part of that as well. So it really does, I think that there's some benefit in thinking more precisely about the different kinds of groups, but recognizing that as the marker for inclusion, right? That there are ways to sort of perhaps more nuance some of those institutional choices, but I don't know that we're fully there yet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There is a question from the audience that asks about inclusion on the subnational level, and this person would like to hear the key federal principles that are related to the inclusion at the subnational level, and whether or not you could share some examples on how federal countries address inclusion on the subnational level.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. This is part of that challenge in using that term of minorities within minorities to think about, within units, how do you ensure that representation of different groups at the subnational level and not just in arrangements at the center. And that's where, again, thinking about, in particular, sort of empowering local level kinds of arrangements, thinking about power sharing within municipalities, thinking about those kinds of different arrangements. So again, in a country like North Macedonia, which is not federal, but more consociation or more power sharing, having some municipalities where Roma are regionally concentrated and having some self-rule at the local level might be one of the ways forward. And again, using all of the levels of governance in there as well.
There is a very fundamental question in the Q&A box as well, and I would like to hear. It's a little bit off off topic, but the person states that there is a lot of states in the world which try to hit the road to federalism and that they failed. The person mentions Bosnia-Herzegovina in Europe, Ethiopia and Somalia in Africa, and they would like to know whether what could be done to reform the Western concept of federalism to match to non-European countries and to adjust to different ways of culture and political culture, as well as could maybe your approach to the accommodation of others, to approaching ethnic federalism help?
Okay, so that's a really big question. It's a great one, but I mean, how much time do we have? But I think, you know, there's an important point here, which is that we need to be careful of template responses, right? That we can't imagine that there, again, is one single way in which to design a federation or consociational arrangement or some other kind of power sharing, that we need to be looking at institutions that sort of reflect and resonate with local populations, right? I think that's a sort of an important starting point. So again, to reflect ideas of culture, political culture, as sort of posed in the question here. And again, I think it's about looking beyond just sort of those big questions, right? So how many units, and do we cut across or design around, and to start to think about what we might call micro rules. And so sort of those smaller sort of, again, how are you know, cabinets put together in federal arrangements, or what are the provisions for the representation from majorities and minorities, but also perhaps others, and thinking about using some of those smaller rules. So rather than saying everyone gets their own unit, it's thinking about using those smaller mechanisms to facilitate that space for inclusion. And again, that comes back to what does it actually look like when people interact in legislative chambers and that kind of thing. So again, thinking about those choices on what kinds of languages are used or recognized, what the sitting hours are, all of those things become important for thinking about inclusion. So there are ways to, again, bring in some of those sort of local experiences and make sure that the institutions resonate with the populations that they're meant to govern.
Mm-hmm. And to follow up what you just said, there is another rather big question that I would like to ask you. Sure. What do you then generally think of ethnic federalism? Do you think ethnic federalism as such is rather problematic? Are alternative arrangements better or more stable? Do they work better? Whether or not there would have been better solutions that were, if they had been focused more on others, like in Bosnia, Ethiopia, or Iraq.
So to the first part of that question, I would say that I think that there are merits to ethnic federalism, right? I think that that accommodation for ethnic majorities and minorities is important. I think that when we want to make sure of inclusion, but I think that so I think that there's something to be said for ethnic federalism. My point is that alongside ethnic, what those choices mean for those who may not identify in the ethnic terms that are being accommodated. So it's not on others, and at the expense of ethnic majorities and minorities. And sort of the second part there was better solutions, more focused on others in Bosnia, Ethiopia, or Iraq. Again, I think the question you know, if you think about the negotiations for the Dayton Peace Accords, it's not like women's organizations weren't trying to sort of influence what was happening in those negotiations. They just weren't included in them, right? So they you know, there were groups those groups that were looking for a seat at the table that weren't included. Would it have led to better? It depends on what we mean by better in that situation. I think that I don't want to make an argument for expediency that we include others and therefore it necessarily becomes a more stable solution. I think that there's a democratic principle at stake here in the inclusion of others, so that again, it's a principle alongside as well.
Mm-hmm. There is another question on regarding your point that you made, that identities are in general multifaceted. We're often talking about ethnicity as the primary point of identification, but at the same time, people identify as gay, people identify as trans, people are identify as women or men, and other groups that you mentioned. There is a question on whether or not, what happens when these categories of others that are not related to ethnicity and ethnic criteria overlap. There is examples that are mentioned that Ethiopia has a female president and Serbia has a gay prime minister. Does this actually make a difference for the accommodation of others?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is really important to recognize that, and this is part, again, of why it's important to think about others in these design choices, which again is that we all have more than one identity, right? Again, ethnicity is not the only way in which we make meaning in our lives. It's an important way, and you know, needs some degree of accommodation and recognition, but so do other aspects of our identities. And so again, it becomes important to think about those intersections as well, right? So then when we think about women's inclusion, women also have ethnic identities, right? The issue, I think, so even if those identities are recognized in those women's ethnic identities are recognized in those design choices, it may not still account for the kinds of exclusion they face as women, right? So having that space for women to participate as women, given the historical experiences of exclusion, becomes important. It also means that we need to think about both descriptive and substantive representation. So basically both, does the government, does Parliament resemble the society that it's meant to govern? But are those outcomes actually sort of working to the advantage or helping to facilitate positive outcomes for those communities? And that is often a separate question, removed from whether or not, a gay prime minister in Serbia enhances, the rights of the entire LGBTQ community in Serbia is a bit of an open question. But that descriptive representation is also really important on its own. But it's not, again, enough. It's about making sure that those outcomes and those policy outcomes are important as well.
Mm-hmm. There was also a question on the state of research, actually, and when you started your presentation, you said that you wrote the paper quite a few years back, and you wanted also to have a look quickly at what has changed in the meantime. So, what is the role of political science scholars or federalism scholars in this? In discussing this dilemma that you were talking about, and exactly in with regards to these overlaps of identities in one person, is there research on that? Is there any research on in what way institutional design choices affect the accommodation of others, or is that a rather new area? You mentioned your research project, but is there?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that there is some research. I think that certainly we can be inspired by some of the literature on intersectionality to start to use that as a lens to thinking about, again, those complex ways in which we organize our lives. There's some increasing some good literature on sort of those trade-offs in ethnic and gender quotas, and what, how they begin to address the inclusion of small minorities and women from the majority, but minority women might get left out, right? So there is some research there. There's quite a sort of new and growing literature on the effects of federalism, and particularly consociationalism for women. I think part of the side is that it's still in that period of highlighting the problems, right? And saying, here's where blockages are. Here's why women may or may not be well represented, or may not support the arrangement, that kind of thing. About, are there ways to rectify that? So are there ways to both accommodate ethnic majorities and minorities and others? I think is a newer area, but still certainly one that merits quite a bit of consideration. So I think it's still a alleviating them. And part of the issue will be that, I don't think any system effectively accommodates everybody, but thinking about how to enhance that democratic potential, I think is where that literature is headed.
You just mentioned that the focus is very much on the blockages of the system sometime, or at the moment still. One blockage of the system may also be the role of the elite, the actual groups that are in decision-making positions. And there is a question on what is their role, or how important is their stance towards the accommodation of others. There's been made an example of Trump's negative stereotyping of women or people with disabilities, but then on the other side also Justin Trudeau's commitment to a gender balanced cabinet, including Indigenous peoples as well. How much do these elite choices matter, and what is their role in moving forward?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. They're very important. I mean, I think that there has to be political will at any point in the process. So the way in which elites respond to these to institutions is an important part of the puzzle, and whether or not those sort of actor choices can often make the difference. And certainly in looking at some of the experiences of gender and power sharing and peace agreements more broadly, certainly one of the things I found in my own research is that often people will point to, it matters who the individual is holding a position, right? So whether or not, so thinking about the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, whether or not that moves forward, whether or not there's a gender perspective in policy choices, often depends on whether the person holding the position, who makes the decisions, is motivated to use that as a lens, right? So a lot does often come down to those sort of personnel choices, and to think about both at the bureaucratic level and also in terms of those elite choices, right? So as the question says about Trump or Trudeau and their what they have said or done, in relation to gender and stereotyping, particularly again Trump on disability there as well. So elites do matter, but what we can hope is that the institutions, again, if you can get them in place, can help to sort of expand that sort of logic of appropriateness within those institutions, and to think about ways to ensure that inclusion becomes a sort of standard of practice rather than an afterthought.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think we're coming to the last question, and I would like maybe to cut back to institutional design in order to overcome the dilemma that you have described in your presentation. And I would like to ask you what federalizing countries or emerging federal systems could actually learn from these discussions. If you could maybe point out a few thoughts on this.
Right. Yeah. I mean, certainly, I think the first is that it's useful to start from that position of how to build inclusive institutions rather than thinking about how to make them more inclusive after the fact. So thinking about how the choices made, the sort of conception of a federation will impact different communities as it moves forward and as it consolidates. So it's not to say that that once those institutions are in place, you can't make them more inclusive. It's just that it's useful to think about those consequences and those opportunities in those negotiations. And that can be hard because, again, there's a lot of pressure on, particularly for conflict resolution, to sort of prioritize, again, those who have that power to spoil any deal, right? So to think about how spoilers are included in that kind of thing. But again, they're not the only constituency. So particularly where peace negotiations culminate in some kind of constitutional reform, that's a constitution for the whole of society. And thinking about both those larger groups who need to be accommodated is also to think about what those choices mean for others. And so I think that's sort of the starting point, is to try to build in some recognition early on that there are ways, again, much smaller scale perhaps, to bring in that kind of inclusion in a more holistic sense.
Thank you very much, Alison, for these conclusive thoughts. And I think we are at the end of this webinar on federalism, democracy, the others. And I would like to thank you, Alison, very much for taking the time, for discussing, for preparing a presentation. And it was to learn from you and to listen to you.
Yeah, thank you.
And for you, our audience, I would like warmly to participate again on the 7th of December for the next Turn on Federalism event. It will take place at the usual. We will discuss the reintegration of de facto state in the case of Ukraine, together with Stefan Wolf and Tatiana Maliarenko. And to thank you. And if you have friends who would also like to listen to Alison's presentations, then you will be able to find this event on the website of the Hans Seidel Foundation, and you can also watch some of the events on YouTube. This now leaves me again to thank you very much, Alison McCulloch, for your presentation and for participating. And if, depending on where you are, we now wish you a very good night, a very good morning, or a very good day, and see you next time.